And joining us now, the president of the University of Toronto, David Naylor. Welcome to TVO.
A pleasure, Steve.
Okay, I guess I got to get all the disclosure. We believe in full disclosure here, so right off the top, I should acknowledge that I am a graduate of your university.
And a distinguished one. We're proud
Well,
to have
I don't
you.
know about that, and so is my wife, and my mother is a former chair of the governing council of your university. So we put all that on the record for people's edification for what it's worth. I want to talk to you about what's happened with the endowment situation at U of T, but first of all, for those who don't know, just give us, because you're thought to be one of the leaders in this endowment fund model. What is all that anyway? Start with that.
Well, basically, Steve, every university in the current climate, particularly the public universities in Canada, has to look at diversifying a revenue base. And students help with their tuitions, families support them, governments give us grants for every student. But we also, fortunately, have a very strong base of alumni support, benefactors, and friends. And as you accumulate and build up those reserves over time, they feed out a revenue stream that is tremendously important for student aid and scholarships, bursaries, for endowed chairs and professorships.
General operations?
To some extent, but usually they're quite targeted.
Okay. The biggest pool of money you ever had in your endowment plan was how much?
It was $50 million from the McLaughlin Foundation. Colonel Sam's legacy came in, brilliant gift, targeting translation of molecular medicine to the bedside.
And the biggest, as a total, the total amount of money you had in the endowment plan at its best was what?
At its best was over $1.8 billion.
$1.8 billion.
Yep.
It's a lot of money. Okay. Here's something from the Ottawa Citizen from a couple of months ago, and you can look up on the monitor there if you want to see the quote. University of Toronto President David Naylor was anticipating a $62 million payout from the endowment fund by April, but that amount could dwindle to nothing.
Correct.
Obviously, with the recession, the market's down, all of that. Is this guy right?
He's right, but let's be clear about one thing. There are endowments underwater right across this country. Our friends at Harvard and Yale are down 25+%. Warren Buffett is off over 30%. So there are an awful lot of investors out there hurting. We had a choice, Steve, to either continue to spend it out, which would mean eating into capital, or to take a one-year pause, and while we wouldn't make the payouts from the accounts, we would find ways to cover those priorities. And so it is that of the $62 million, we've gone into all the rainy day funds, we ransacked the cupboards, and we have covered the overwhelming majority of those commitments. The endowed chairs, the student aid for sure.
Does this mean you don't have to go into deficit this year? We
have prepared that if we have to, we can take up to $45 million of loans, but I don't think we're going to use it all. And as much as the endowment has hurt, I will say to you that in general there's a squeeze on universities. Obviously government funding is being squeezed. So all in all, if you think about our operating budget, important to keep in mind, total throughput annually is $1.8 billion. If you take the research out, you're still talking 1.3, 1.4 billion. 62 million, less than 5%. So we are able to cope and to find in funds and bridge.
Putting it in perspective, that does make some sense. However, you're at the closer to the top as opposed to the bottom of losses. A 30% loss in your endowment.
Yep.
How much money did that represent?
You can do the math. 30% on 1.8 billion.
That's a lot of dough.
It's a lot of dough, and we're not very happy.
Does it make you question the entire endowment strategy?
No. It's different than questioning the endowment strategy. Let me be very clear about that. The long-term benefit of having those endowed funds is massive. They've helped us to secure the best and brightest students through bursaries and scholarships, recruit great professors. It's a winning strategy for the long term. But what it does tell you very clearly is you want to manage those assets prudently. You have to accept that you will have some bad years. And you also want to have, obviously, the strong platform of public support, which has been a little variable in Ontario and across Canada if you compare us to the US. And so we've never imagined ourselves doing a Harvard or Yale on a grand scale where 30 or 40% of the revenue comes from the endowment. That's not the Canadian way. But I think having endowed funds that help you meet your mission, I think that's pretty critical and a real comparative advantage. So rethinking the strategy of trying to raise money for the endowment, no. Thinking carefully about the structure and the investment strategy, yes.
Okay, in which case, I don't normally ask too many smart-ass questions on this show, but I'm going to make an exception for this one right here. The guy who's responsible for making sure that that endowment doesn't go down, but rather goes up, he makes $600,000 a year. That's more than you make. Did you want to fire him when you saw what the numbers were like for past year?
No.
You didn't?
No.
Why not?
Well, that is a tough question. But let's first of all look at where the whole of the market has been and how some people have done. Let's secondly look at the fact that we have a new CEO who just came in and walked into this perfect storm. And so much of what he was dealing with was a legacy of the organization under previous leadership, and he's been trimming the sails in the storm pretty effectively. So am I concerned? Yes. Am I going to look at the structure and the strategy? Yes. Are we certainly looking at the fact that bonuses could be affected by these returns? They sure will be. But I don't think you go in with a new CEO who's come in who has a sterling reputation and say, you inherited a mess, now we're going to hold you accountable. Out you go, Joe.
No,
That's
I hear
not
you,
the way
but
you do it.
you must have heard from alumni who, of course, you depend on for donations to keep the university going and to keep that endowment fund nice and in the black, who must have said to you, I'm giving you this money, and you guys are, fill in the blank with some expletive deletive, it away. Some heads have got to roll on this. Should heads not roll?
I don't think you roll heads until you figure out where you stand relative to others. I don't think you roll heads when you have a new team. And I think what you do is you take stock, you avoid the sort of name, blame, shame game. You look to move and improve an organization that is a subsidiary. And if, in the fullness of time, you're not making the changes you want and the strategy doesn't work, then you find other ways to move it forward, and perhaps some people leave. But in the short term, I don't think that's the best way to respond. And on the alumni piece, very interesting to think about how alumni have responded. We've had some benefactors come forward, Steve, and give us additional gifts saying, you are offering to bridge fund this endowment payout. We'll help you out this year. We've had some benefactors come forward and say it's a tough year for students and the university. Here's a short-term gift. Spend it out over the next couple of years on scholarships and bursaries.
I'll bet they're saying don't do it again, though.
I'm saying don't do it again as well, so that's two of us.
But presumably, I mean, have you told your people, we got to get out of the markets, we got to be more into bonds or stuff that's more stable? Have you had that conversation?
Everyone is a genius at investing in hindsight.
Afterwards, sure.
You know, so I have to tell you, it's been fascinating to me as I talk to people. First, how many of the very savvy individuals, high net worth, who have given us support through the years, turn out to have done just as badly as we did. And secondly, when you talk to other people, how many are quite convinced they saw this all coming, and you ask them, were you in cash? No, they weren't in cash.
Right.
So I think everyone's a genius in hindsight, so we're not going to try to do great second guessing, but we need to look at the overall strategy.
Where did you have most of the money invested that ended up disappearing on you?
This is really an interesting story. Teachers, great plan, down 18%. As
Teachers'
I said,
pension plan.
Yeah. Warren Buffett down over 30. Harvard and Yale down 25 plus. And when you look at our numbers, we were down 18% on the actual assets, and an additional 11.5% was lost because they hedged on the Canadian dollar. Brilliant strategy in theory, but you don't count on having the Canadian dollar disappear against the US dollar in the course of a few weeks. So that cataclysmic shift in currency basically accounted for a huge amount of the loss. And that's one reason why I'm not in a great hurry to suddenly throw baby and bathwater out together. And fortunately, they've already changed the currency hedging strategy, a bit like bolting the door after the horse is gone, but a corrective action has been taken. And so we'll nudge this along and we'll look carefully, and it will come back. 5 years of performance, such as the very good performance we had before this year, all the holes are filled in, we're back fully on track, so I think we'll be fine.
That's 5 years down the road, but I'm sure people want to know right now, I mean, according to your 2008 endowment report, 43% of endowments were devoted towards funding student aid, 31% of endowments dedicated toward funding chairs and professorships.
Yep.
Have you been able to find the money to replace?
Yep.
And so those are all status quo?
Yep.
You've saved it?
Yep.
Moving
Absolutely.
on.
And next year, we're committed to making a payout. We've already had some return. The markets have moved up. But you know what? If they don't come all the way up, we'll reach into the capital and go ahead and start paying, because ultimately, that's why we were given the money. We'll meet those commitments. We've met it this year for internal funds, and the main response from a lot of alumni has been, wish the market had done better with you and for you, but thank you for stepping forward and meeting the commitments that the funds were supposed to be meeting and supporting the cause that I believe in. Mostly they've said thank you. We've not had a lot of hate mail.
How much will tuition have to go up to cover the losses here?
Tuition increases are not related to this loss. This is a one-time loss. It's not a long-term hit at all. The tuition increases that have happened through the years relate to the funding challenge that I put earlier on the table. Ontario is 25 to 28% below the average of the other 9 provinces in per student funding. That's a long-term trend. And if you ask yourself, where are tuitions highest in this country? The 2 provinces with the highest tuitions are Nova Scotia and Ontario, which also have the lowest per student funding. There's a pretty clear relationship there, and we see it in the US as well. So tuitions are not about the endowment. At 4% of the operating budget, it's not the key factor. No, it's government funding.
I appreciate that, but I think it's also accurate to say that if you come into the University of Toronto next year as a part-time student taking only 2 or 3 courses rather than a full course load, you're still going to have to pay the equivalent of a full course load. That's an increase in effect, is it not?
No, you have to be taking 3 courses and be enrolled in arts and science, and then there'll be full course fees. But again, this is
But you're not taking full courses, but you're being charged full course fee.
Remember, if you look at how program fees apply across Ontario, we have program fees in multiple institutions. Right now, the majority of arts and science programs in Ontario operate on a program fee basis. You take 3.5 courses, you take 4 courses, you pay the full freight. You take 6 courses, you still pay for 5. Computer science and commerce at the University of Toronto already operate on that basis. Engineering operates on this basis. 2 courses, you're part-time, you're out of that particular game. 3 courses, you're eligible for all the student aid. We spend tens of millions of dollars of internal resources on student aid, including filling in those endowments that you were flagging, so unhelpfully, I might add. And on top of that, there we are with these new funds drawing down $1.5 million to be recycled into student aid. One of the great pieces of mythology out there is that these tuition increases always impede access. We pull a large amount of money out of tuition increases to go into bursaries to help maintain access. So it's not simple.
Tough sell on the students, though, for them to believe that.
Tough sell on the street. You talk to politicians, and they'll tell you this is a tough sell. It's counterintuitive, and yet international, interjurisdictional data show repeatedly tuition increases are not what drive reduction in access. Participation rates in Quebec are lower than in Ontario.
And their tuition's way cheaper.
Tuition's way cheaper. So it's really a paradoxical set of relationships, and taking tuition revenue into bursaries turns out to be a great way to maintain access when governments are unwilling through progressive taxes to give the money to student aid and to universities.
I want to do a fast note to the control room here. Michael, I want to skip the board on the top of Chapter 4. I want to go to the last board because we're down to our last couple of minutes here, and I got to save some time for the competition, which is York University.
All right.
What is the university's role? This was a conversation that took place on the Varsity, the student newspaper's website, when they heard about all of the financial stuff that we've been talking about today. And here's how it goes. U of T, this person says, does not need to have unlimited growth as the governing council wants. That is insane. They are religious fanatics for corporate capitalism at its worst excesses, despite its total failure and its destruction of life on earth. A smaller, more ethical university with academic freedoms and curricula that help students to think critically and not blindly accept corporate ideology and dogma would be ideal. The university should be an instrument for the social good, not a tool for destruction of the social good. This
sounds like a highly nuanced and subtle and persuasive set of arguments based on strong evidence.
Maybe not, but
clearly a failure of the university system there.
The guy is speaking to the notion that I guess, and U of T would be one of, I think, many he's pointing to, who are all about trying to capture corporate donations and corporate dollars nowadays and have lost the broader sense of mission of what universities are supposed to be about. To which you say?
Balderdash. Balderdash.
How so?
So let's think about new initiatives at the university. First off, so far from being into indefinite growth, we're actually talking, if we can afford it, about capping undergraduate growth on the St. George campus, even reducing the numbers to try to improve student experience. Focus is very much on graduate and professional programs. And east and west campuses at Scarborough and Mississauga may well grow. Secondly, and importantly, our percentage of funding in our research portfolio from industry is lower than any other Canadian university except McGill. We're sort of neck and neck for lowest.
Per capita, you mean?
in terms of the total percentage.
Total, okay.
So absolute amounts, sure, there's lots of money from industry, but most of the money comes from peer-reviewed sources and foundations and so on. And colleagues use it to pursue the most provocative and interesting questions they can dream up with their graduate students, and sometimes their undergraduates. Third point on this one that's critical. Every university has built protections into those industrial contracts that speak to things such as the freedom of graduate students to publish. Very important. You don't want that thesis held up while some corporate czar is pawing over the entrails of the dissertation. They also allow the researchers to have access to intellectual property, frequently to own it outright. So all those contracts have provisions and protections in them, and they are all reviewed centrally.
This guy's wrong, you're saying?
He is wrong, and in terms of where the university is at, you know, of course we're engaged with business. We're also engaged with a host of social causes and agencies. Universities are very much part of their community and the fabric of those communities. And you know, the social good has been, always will be, central to what universities are about.
David Naylor, president of the U of T. Thanks for coming in tonight and talking to us on TVO.
Nice to chat with you.